Echoes of Terra, the Garden and the Battlefield. Part 1. The sky over Verwia, once a serene canvas of pale lavender, was now scarred with the oily black smoke of ruin. Elder Rootsinger, whose bark had weathered 1,000 seasons, felt the tremors of the Crocklin assault, not through its 3 deeply set legs, but as a violation of the planet's very soul. The crystalline forests, which sang with the slightest breeze, now screamed as they were shattered by plasma bombardments from the colossal, shell-shaped ship hanging in orbit like a malevolent god. The Crocklin had come without warning, hulking humanoid turtles, their bodies encased in bio-integrated armor that mirrored the concentric patterns of their natural shells. Their technology was a marvel, rivaling the most advanced races of the United Coalition of Planets. It was to the UCP that Rootsinger had broadcast Veriat's plea. Their distress beacon, a chorus of harmonic despair, had reached every member world. The replies had trickled back, each a perfectly crafted excuse steeped in bureaucratic cowardice. The Gathar hegemony cited pre-existing fleet engagements. The Lumina Concordance was hampered by unfortunate solar flare activity, disrupting their warp lanes. The reply from the Rigelian Assembly was the cruelest, a simple automated message acknowledging receipt of the beacon, followed by silence. Hope withered. The Verwiat, a species of 15-foot-tall arboreal beings, could not fight. They could only endure, and now it seemed they could only die or be enslaved. The Crocklin landing craft were beginning to descend, their shadows sweeping over the panicked groves. Rootsinger resonated a low thrum of acceptance, a final somber song for its people. Then came a new sound, not the surgical hiss of plasma, but a deep guttural roar that tore through the atmosphere. It was a sound of brute force, of raw power ripping the sky asunder. Hundreds of fiery streaks plunged downwards, not with the cold grace of Crocklin ships, but with the uncontrolled violence of falling mountains. They slammed into the loamy soil, each impact sending a thundering shockwave that vibrated through Rootsinger's very core. For a moment, the Veriat believed this was it, a final planet-cracking bombardment. But these were not bombs. They were blocky, utilitarian pods of scorched metal, devoid of any aesthetic. A sharp hiss, followed by an explosive blast, blew the doors from their hinges. From within the smoke and steam emerged bipedal figures, entirely encased in shimmering, form-fitting suits that warped the light around them, rendering them faceless and anonymous. They moved with an unsettling purpose. There was no posturing, no declaration. One group immediately began erecting inflatable, sterile white tents, their movements economical and practiced. They carried Verwiat wounded from the initial panic, their touch surprisingly gentle as they administered aid. The other figures fanned out, forming a perimeter. They carried long, angular weapons of black metal, crude, primitive things compared to the elegant plasma casters of the Crocklin. The first of the Crocklin dropships touched down, its ramp lowering with a ponderous groan. Heavily armored warriors, each the size of a small boulder, stomped out, their energy rifles glowing with lethal potential. They paused, momentarily confused by this new, unexpected variable on the battlefield. The apparent leader of the faceless beings, distinguished only by a subtle command antenna on its helmet, turned to face Rootsinger. It raised its hands to its helmet, the light-bending shimmer of its suit deactivating. With a pneumatic sigh, the helmet was lifted. The face beneath was not some new horror. It was pale, with short-cropped dark hair and eyes the color of a stormy sky. It was a face from the archives, from history videos a century old. It was a male Terran. A collective gasp, a rustling of 1,000 leaves, swept through the assembled Verwiat. Terrans extinct, wiped out in the Procyon burn-off over 150 years ago. A ghost species, a footnote in UCP's great history. The Terran commander's eyes met Rootsinger's central photosensitive cluster. His expression was grim, devoid of ceremony. "We received your call," he said, his voice amplified by a small device on his collar. "We sent no reply. It would have delayed our departure." Rootsinger could only manage a single resonant thrum. "You came." It took 16 hours at Warp 6-1, the Terran continued, as if explaining a simple logistical problem. We brought what we could. Echoes of Terra, the Garden and the Battlefield. Part 2. Before Rootsinger could process the reality of their impossible saviors, the Crocklin commander bellowed a challenge in its guttural tongue and fired. A silent, blindingly bright bolt of plasma shot across the clearing. The Terran commander didn't flinch. He was already moving, dropping to a knee as his soldiers opened fire. The air exploded with a deafening cacophony. The Terran weapons were not silent. They were kinetic. They spat metal projectiles at supersonic speeds, each shot accompanied by a thunderous crack that echoed off the shattered crystal trees. The Crocklin's personal shields flared, absorbing the first few impacts. But the Terrans didn't stop. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace that belied their primitive technology. It was brutally efficient. They didn't spray and pray, they aimed. A 3-round burst to a weak point in the shield matrix near the neck, followed by 2 more rounds to the unarmored flesh beneath. A Crocklin warrior would stagger, its shield would collapse, and then it would fall, thick green blood pooling from neat, precise holes. The Terrans advanced, their shimmering suits blurring their forms as they sprinted from cover to cover. They moved like a pack, each soldier seeming to know what the others would do without a single word. Their loud, violent weapons chewed through the Crocklin ranks. The invaders, so accustomed to the supremacy of their silent energy weapons and impenetrable armor, were thrown into disarray by the sheer concussive violence and astonishing accuracy of the Terran assault. The Terran commander stood, his own rifle barking in his hands. He took down a Crocklin warrior with 2 shots, the rounds hitting the exact same spot on the warrior's helmet visor, shattering it and the skull within. Rootsinger watched, rooted in a mixture of terror and awe. The UCP, with all its power and advanced technology, had offered excuses. The Terrans, a dead race armed with what amounted to museum pieces, had offered their lives. They hadn't come to negotiate or posture. They had come to fight, with a brutal efficiency that was both terrifying and the most beautiful thing the Elder had ever witnessed. In the thunder of their crude weapons, the Verwiat heard a new song, the sound of hope. The battle was a symphony of chaos conducted by the Terran commander, a man Rootsinger now knew as Jax. The Verwiat Elder watched, transfixed, as the Terrans dismantled a technologically superior force with what amounted to controlled savagery. The Crocklin were titans, their plasma casters erasing whatever they hit, but they fought like individuals. They were a collection of powerful warriors. The Terrans were a single organism, a pack of wolves flowing around a lumbering bear. Their shimmering suits were not perfect camouflage, but they distorted their silhouettes, making them maddening targets against the fractured, crystalline landscape. The Crocklin targeting systems, designed for precision, struggled to achieve a solid lock. The Terrans, however, didn't need computers to aim. Their eyes, honed by a century of unknown hardship, did the work. A Crocklin heavy weapons specialist hunkered down, deploying a portable shield and preparing to fire a devastating particle beam. Before it could power up, a Terran soldier slid behind a shard of crystal, braced a long cylindrical launcher on their shoulder, and fired. There was a whoosh, and a projectile screamed across the clearing, striking the Crocklin's shield. The shield didn't just flicker, it shattered in a wave of hexagonal energy fragments. A second later, 2 more Terrans, positioned at a flanking angle, stitched a trio of kinetic rounds through the now exposed warrior. It was over in seconds. Target identified, threat assessed, neutralized. Rootsinger's people did not have a word for what the Terrans were doing. It was a calculus of death, performed with the cold proficiency of a master artisan. They used suppressing fire not to kill, but to force the Crocklin into predictable cover, which other Terran fire teams had already zeroed in on. They threw small black canisters that erupted not in fire, but in concussive waves of sound that stunned the Crocklin, whose sensitive auditory systems were housed within their thick skulls. In the half-second of disorientation, the Terrans would surge forward, their rifles barking their deadly rhythm. Echoes of Terra, The Garden and the Battlefield, Part 3. The Crocklin Field Commander, its shell adorned with honorific carvings, roared in fury. It pointed its own oversized caster at Jax and fired a sustained beam of energy. Jax didn't dive. He took a single, precise step to his left. The beam seared the air where he had been, melting a crystalline tree trunk into slag. As the Crocklin commander adjusted its aim, Jax raised his rifle. He didn't fire a burst, he fired one shot. The high-velocity round, likely a specialized armor-piercing type, struck the Crocklin's weapon directly on its emitter coil. The advanced plasma caster exploded, taking the warrior's hands and half its chest with it. The Titan fell with a ground-shaking thud. The death of their leader broke the Crocklin assault. Their methodical advance devolved into a confused rout. Seeing their advantage crumble, the surviving warriors began to fall back towards their dropship, their retreat punctuated by the relentless crack, crack, crack of Terran rifles. The Terrans did not give chase. They advanced to the edge of the perimeter they had established, dropped to a knee, and secured the area. The silence that followed was deeper and shocking than the noise had been. The air was thick with the scent of ozone from the plasma discharges and the acrid smell of Terran propellants. The first skirmish was over. In the center of the clearing, surrounded by the still forms of 24 Crocklin invaders, the Terrans began methodically reloading their weapons and checking on their own wounded. There were few. Jax walked back towards Rootsinger, his boots making soft sounds on the loam. His face was unreadable, splattered with a few drops of green Crocklin blood. He stopped before the massive Verviat, his rifle now held loosely at his side. "The immediate ground threat is neutralized," he stated, his voice calm, as if reporting on a weather pattern. "They'll be back with more." Rootsinger took a moment to form a resonance, its leaves quivering. How? The thrumming question was layered with 1,000 meanings. How are you here? How are you alive? How did you do what we just saw? Jax's expression tightened, the first flicker of emotion Rootsinger had seen on his face. It was a deep, ancient weariness. History forgets what it wants to forget, Elder. The UCP reported our extinction because they glassed Procyon Prime and left. They never bothered to check the outlying asteroid colonies or the deep space mining vessels. They didn't count the survivors. He gestured with his chin towards his soldiers. We've had 150 years with no one to rely on but ourselves. No supply lines, no reinforcements, no grand coalition to appeal to. We learned to make every shot count. We learned to make our own gear last. We learned to fight outnumbered, because we have always been outnumbered. He looked up, past the shattered canopy, to the immense, shell-like mothership that still dominated the sky. The UCP had fleets, advanced technology, and treaties. They had every reason to help you, and they chose not to, Jax said, his voice dropping to a low, intense growl. We had nothing but a long-range listening post and a handful of light cruisers held together with scavenged parts. We had every reason to stay hidden. He met Rootsinger's gaze again, his stormy eyes burning with a conviction that seemed to radiate heat. But we remember what it's like to be left for dead, so we came. As Jax spoke on the surface, the reason for his confidence and his urgency was playing out in the cold, silent vacuum above Verwia. The Terran fleet was a collection of cosmic insults. There were 4 ships in total, led by the light cruiser TCS Resilience. They were not the sleek, elegant vessels of the UCP. They were ugly, asymmetrical blocks of metal, scarred by countless repairs and retrofits. Welded armor plates covered old wounds. Oversized engine blocks were bolted onto their sterns like afterthoughts, and their hulls were a chaotic lattice of exposed conduits and weapon emplacements. They looked less like warships and more like flying scrapyards that had decided to pick a fight. Opposing them was the singular, magnificent horror of the Crocklin dreadnought, the unbreakable carapace. It was a masterpiece of biomechanical engineering, a nautilus of shimmering armor tens of kilometers long. Its surface swirled with intricate patterns that were both hull plating and energy conduits. It was a moving fortress, a symbol of an empire's might, and it was being circled by 4 angry junkyard dogs. Echoes of Terra, the Garden and the Battlefield. Part 4. Status on the Carapace's ventral plasma cannon. Captain Eva Madsen's voice was sharp, cutting through the low thrum of the Resilience's bridge. The bridge was a place of function, not comfort. Hardwired consoles displayed flickering green and amber data streams instead of elegant holograms. Every crew member was strapped into a high-G crash couch. "It's cycling up for another volley, Captain." "Estimated charge time, 30 seconds. The tactical officer yelled over a proximity alert siren. "Their point defense lasers are carving up torpedo salvo gamma." "Forget gamma. Kai, give me a hard burn, port side thrusters. I want to slide under its firing arc. Signal the hammerhead and anvil to concentrate fire on that cannon's power coupling, grid 7-9 Delta. They're launching another wave of interceptors," the comms officer reported, his knuckles white on his console. "Let 'em," Madsen grunted, her eyes locked on the main view screen. "That's what the Spitfire is for." The smallest of the Terran ships, a frigate aptly named the Spitfire, broke formation. It was little more than a massive engine with a cockpit and dozens of point defense turrets strapped to it. It flew directly towards the swarm of sleek, crescent-shaped Crocklin interceptors, unleashing a biblical storm of flak. The vacuum of space was filled with thousands of kinetic projectiles, creating a deadly expanding cloud of shrapnel that the agile Crocklin fighters had to navigate. It was a crude, inefficient tactic that bled ammunition, but it worked, turning a sophisticated fighter screen into a chaotic debris field. The Resilience shuddered as a secondary energy beam from the Crocklin dreadnought grazed its shields. Lights flickered on the bridge, and a damage control officer screamed, "Shields at 40%. We have hull breaches on decks 6 and 7. Seal it off!" Madsen ordered without looking away from the screen. "All remaining power to forward shields and the main driver." The Terran strategy was one of 1,000 cuts. They couldn't hope to crack the unbreakable carapace, but they could break its weapons. The Hammerhead and the Anvil, 2 smaller destroyers, focused their magnetic accelerator cannons on the spot Madsen had indicated. There was no flash or beam, only a silent, invisible distortion as massive slugs of depleted uranium, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light, crossed the void. The first slug hammered into the dreadnought's shield, causing it to flare with incandescent energy. The second and third struck the same spot in rapid succession. The shield buckled. The fourth slug slammed into the hull itself. Armor forged from alloys the UCP could only dream of was peeled back like tin foil. The Crocklin ship, like a wounded giant, began to turn its awesome bulk, trying to bring other weapon systems to bear. But it was too slow. It was a battleship designed to fight other battleships in stately, honorable combat. It was not designed to fight rabid animals chewing on its vulnerable underbelly. "The main driver is charged, Captain," the tactical officer announced, a grim smile on his face. "Fire," Madsen said softly. The entire frame of the Resilience groaned in protest as its primary weapon, a spinal-mounted Mac cannon that ran 2/3 the length of the ship, unleashed its payload. The 10-ton ferrous slug was nearly invisible as it crossed the distance, its kinetic energy alone enough to shatter a small moon. It struck the already damaged power coupling of the ventral plasma cannon. The result was spectacular. A chain reaction ripped through the Crocklin weapon system. A silent, blinding flash of blue-white light erupted from the dreadnought's underside as its own cannon imploded, tearing a colossal, gaping wound in the magnificent shell. Cheers erupted on the bridge of the Resilience, but they were cut short by the comms officer. "Captain, the Anvil is hit. Multiple plasma strikes. Their engines are gone. Life support is failing." Madsen's face hardened. She watched the crippled Terran destroyer tumbling helplessly in space. Did they clear the landing corridor for Jax's heavy reinforcements? "Yes, ma'am," the officer replied, his voice thick with emotion. "The path is open." "Then they did their job," Madsen said, her voice a cold, hard stone. She turned her gaze back to the wounded Crocklin dreadnought. They had won the engagement, but the cost, as always, was steep. Helm, get us into a defensive position over the primary landing zone. Tactical, I want a damage report and our remaining munitions count. We bought the ground pounders sometime. Let's make sure they use it. Echoes of Terra. The Garden and the Battlefield. Part 5. On the surface of Verwia, the silent flashes in the lavender sky were the only indication of the life and death struggle unfolding in orbit. One of the pinpricks of light representing the Terran ships suddenly vanished, and Rootsinger resonated a low thrum of sorrow. Jax, however, merely looked up, his face a mask of grim calculation. "They've opened the lane," he said, more to himself than to the Elder. He tapped his comms unit. "All units stand by for inbound heavy assets. Designate landing zone Bravo." As if in response, new stars began to burn in the upper atmosphere. These were not the small, arrow-like drop pods that had brought the first wave of soldiers. These were behemoths, huge, clumsy-looking transport barges that screamed through the air under the strain of atmospheric friction. They were the color of rust and primer, shaped like armored bricks, and they descended on pillars of dirty orange fire. They did not land so much as crash with purpose. 3 of them slammed into the ground a kilometer from the established perimeter, their impact shocks nearly uprooting Rootsinger. Massive forward ramps slammed down, and from their cavernous holds rumbled the true face of Terran warfare. They were not quiet, hovering skimmers or elegant UCP walkers. They were tanks, monstrous tracked vehicles that chewed up the soft loam and spat it out behind them. Their diesel-electric engines roared with a throaty, ground-shaking power, spewing plumes of grey exhaust into the air. Each was armed with a cannon of obscene proportions, a brutal-looking piece of artillery designed not for surgical strikes, but for obliteration. On the side of the lead tank's turret, someone had crudely painted a snarling wolf's head. Following the tanks came the artillery. Self-propelled gun platforms, essentially massive cannons mounted on tracked chassis, lumbered out and began positioning themselves behind the main line. Engineers followed, driving squat, powerful vehicles with dozer blades and crane arms. They immediately set to work, digging trenches, raising earthen berms, and deploying prefabricated plasteel barricades from the transport barges. In less than 30 minutes, the serene glade where the Terrans had first landed was gone. In its place was a fortress, a firebase. It was a scar of mud, metal, and fumes carved into the heart of the crystalline forest. Jax was a whirlwind of motion, his voice a constant authoritative bark on the command channel, directing the flow of metal and men with practiced ease. Artillery section. I want a firing solution for every major approach vector. Reference grid alpha through theta. Armor platoon. Establish a primary line at the riverbed. I want overlapping fields of fire. Engineers, get those automated point defense turrets online yesterday. Rootsinger watched it all, its ancient mind struggling to reconcile 2 conflicting truths. These beings were its people's saviors. The rhythmic clang of their hammers and the roar of their engines was the sound of salvation. Yet it was a terrifying sound. The Verwiat did not build, they grew. They did not conquer, they coexisted. The Terrans were a force of pure industrial will, bending the landscape to their needs with a speed and violence that was utterly alien. They were poisoning the soil with their leaking fluids and polluting the air with their exhaust, all to save a world they had never known. It was a paradox that was both beautiful and horrifying. A young Terran engineer, her face smudged with grease, patted the thick steel hull of a newly deployed artillery piece. She spoke to the machine, her words lost in the din, but her affection for the instrument of war was clear. This was the Terran way. They did not just use their tools, they seemed to love them, to trust these crude, loud machines as extensions of their own stubborn will to survive. Jack strode back to Rootsinger, holding a small electronic tablet that displayed a tactical map of the growing fortress. The carapace is wounded, but it's not blind. Their next ground assault will be coordinated and overwhelming. They'll try to crush us before we can fully dig in. He pointed to a spot on the map. Your people, keep them behind this line. We'll hold it. There was no boast in his voice, no flourish of heroism, It was a simple statement of fact, a promise forged in the engine grease and spent shell casings of a people who had learned that the only thing you could truly rely on was the fortified ground beneath your feet and the weapon in your hands. Rootsinger extended a thin, vine-like tendril and gently touched the screen of the tablet, tracing the hard, angular lines of the fortifications the Terrans had carved into its world. "You are destroying our home to save it," Rootsinger resonated, its tone a complex harmony of gratitude and grief. Echoes of Terra, the Garden and the Battlefield, Part 6. Jax's stormy eyes softened for a fraction of a second. "We are," he admitted, his voice low. "But we've learned a hard lesson, Elder. It's better to live on a battlefield than to die in a garden." 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, the planet Verwia ceased to be a home and became a theorem of violence being solved by fire and steel. Rootsinger bore witness to a war that defied every Verwiat concept of existence. The thunder of the Terran artillery became the planet's new heartbeat, a constant concussive rhythm that never ceased, day or night. The crystalline forests were systematically pulverized into glittering dust, the air so thick with smoke and pulverized earth that the lavender sky was a forgotten memory. The Croclin, arrogant in their technological might, had expected to crush the primitives in a single overwhelming assault. They had been wrong. They threw wave after wave of their heavily armored warriors and sleek grav tanks at the Terran fortress, and each wave broke upon a wall of unrelenting kinetic fury. The Terrans did not fight a war of grand maneuvers. They fought a war of logistics and attrition. Their engineers were relentless, scavenging materials from destroyed Croclin vehicles to patch their own battered tanks. They turned battlefield debris into new fortifications. Their medics performed miracles in the blood-soaked triage tents, and their soldiers simply refused to break. They held the line with a grim determination that bordered on the suicidal, bleeding for every inch of mud. Above, the orbital dance of death continued. Captain Madsen's battered fleet, now down to just the Resilience and the Spitfire, could no longer fight the unbreakable carapace head-on. Instead, they became ghosts, hiding behind Verwia's moons, making daring high-speed raids to torpedo the Croclin supply ships that attempted to reinforce the ground troops. They had severed the head from the body. The Croclin on the surface were now alone. The breaking point came on the 23rd day. Mustering their remaining strength, the Croclin launched an all-out assault on Sector Gamma, the weakest point in the Terran line. Their new ground commander, a veteran warrior with a shell of obsidian black, led the charge from a massive command crawler. For hours the battle raged, the ferocity of the Croclin attack pushing the Terrans to their absolute limit. Then, through the smoke and chaos, Jax led a counterattack. It was not a grand charge. It was a surgical strike with the last 3 operational Terran tanks. He punched a hole in the Croclin flank and, in a suicidal drive, slammed his own command tank directly into the Croclin command crawler. The resulting explosion was colossal, a miniature sun that vaporized both vehicles and sent a shockwave that flattened what was left of the forest for a mile in every direction. From the wreckage, Jax emerged, his armor scorched, his face bleeding, but alive. The loss of a second commander in as many weeks shattered the Croclin morale completely. Their coordinated assault fell apart. An hour later, a single unarmored Croclin approached the Terran line under a white flag. The surrender was held in the shadow of one of the colossal, crashed Terran transport barges. The air was still and heavy, smelling of burnt metal and damp earth. What remained of the Croclin ground army stood in disciplined, silent rows. Their magnificent armor was dented, scorched, and splattered with the green of their own blood. Their new commander, a much younger Croclin who had inherited the role by default, strode forward. Opposite them stood Jax and 2 squads of his soldiers. They were not pristine victors. They were gaunt, exhausted survivors. Their armor was a patchwork of repairs. Their faces were hollowed-out masks of fatigue. There were no victory cheers, no triumphant speeches, only a profound shared weariness. The Crocklin commander removed its ornate plasma rifle, a symbol of its authority, holding it horizontally in its three-fingered hands. It approached Jax and bowed its head, a gesture of profound submission, offering the weapon. Jax looked at the defeated warrior, then at the offered rifle. He did not take it. Instead, he simply placed his hand on Crocklin's shoulder for a moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. The message was clear. We understand, it's over. The Crocklin commander straightened, a look of surprise and grudging respect in its reptilian eyes. It lowered the weapon and backed away, its army turning to lay down their arms. Rootsinger watched from a nearby rise, the surviving Verwiat rustling their leaves around it. Their world was saved. It was a ruin, scarred and broken, but it was theirs again. The ground would heal. The crystalline forests would, in time, regrow. Ending the Terrans had come as a ghost story and had won an impossible war. They had met a superior technological force and had ground it into submission through sheer, stubborn will. Rootsinger looked at Jax, who was now overseeing the disarming of the Crocklin prisoners with the same grim efficiency he had shown in battle. The Verwiat now understood. The Terrans were not simply warriors. They were children of disaster, forged in the crucible of extinction. The UCP had dismissed them as a tragic footnote, but the galaxy was about to learn that a footnote, when written in blood and iron, can become the first chapter of a terrifying new history. Thanks for watching. It really means a lot. Hit the like, share and add to favorites buttons. Don't forget to follow for sci-fi stories like this and more.